Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting into Extreme Carnage Alpha, which is the part 1 of 8 of the Extreme Carnage event, which kicks things back off after King in Black and Venom issue 200. So with that being said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so we're jumping into Extreme Carnage Alpha. Just with the way that this starts, it's really a continuation from Venom Island. Because if you guys remember, back at the time when Venom Island concluded, Eddie went on to tell the Avengers that Knull was on his way, but then we also got this post-credit scene with the Carnage Symbiote hopping off the island and then re-emerging as a shark. And with Extreme Carnage at least starting off that way, there's a couple things that come to mind. Because for one, I at least appreciate it acknowledging the Carnage shark by showing us the island and then the Carnage Symbiote just jumping from fish to fish, because in a way this is kind of catching us up to what Carnage has been doing since Venom Island, and I guess during the time of Empire, Venom Beyond, and King in Black. Because as we continue through Extreme Carnage Alpha, which starts in the present day, we also get this trail of events of where Carnage has been, which eventually just catches up to the events that are happening now. But even with us getting this connecting information, there's still this huge gap from the Carnage shark all the way up to a week before this story starts. So with that being the case, Marvel's gotta give us Finding Cletus a shark story, with just Carnage being a shark for 6 issues or something, because we need more filler information. But where this story officially starts, we pick up in a world that is clearly after the conclusion of King in Black, and also after Venom issue 200, because when it starts off, we begin with Senator Krang of New York, and he's making this speech about how the world has changed, and with them talking about the recent invasion, he's hyping people up, talking about first it was the mutants, now it's the aliens, and even on a good day how superhuman threats have just gone unchecked. And because of this, he's introducing the Birthright Act, which he says will make sure that humans don't have to share this world with aliens. But also here he announces his new partnership with the newly reorganized and refocused Friends of Humanity, to where in this case I'm pretty sure the only thing that's different is that they're targeting aliens as well as mutants. But for Senator Peter Crane, it's pretty huge, for him at least, that these speeches and his public appearances go well. Because for one, he wants to be the face of the anti-alien movement, and if he's able to get the people on his side while also fundraising for this movement, he'll use that money and that influence as well as the help from the Friends of Humanity in order to make his way to being president of the United States. But also what I find interesting is when one of his campaign managers or directors or people just helping, one of them asks his son Arthur if he wants to be more involved with his father's campaign, and Arthur brings up the interesting fact of if you're trying to deport all aliens, what happens when we get the Thor and Hyperion, or I guess pretty much anyone who's kind of up there. And his dad, Senator Crane, he's pretty much just boy, shut up, don't bring that up to the press. I don't want that much smoke. But also to spin things into his favor, he says the only thing that's in between him and the presidency, it's one alien killing spree. But also around this time, we go back to catch up a bit more about Carnage. And when we do, we see the Carnage shark attacking a few Somali pirates, and then from there, the Carnage symbiote goes from the shark to one of the pirates who'd survived, to where after, this pirate then made their way over to a meeting that was being held between a Somali warlord and a representative of the American Arms Division of Alchemax. And this is what brings us up to now, with that American representative making his way back to the States, to where he arrives at JFK Airport, and this is how Carnage gets back to the USA. But they couldn't call this one Carnage USA because that name's already taken. Carnage already used that name already. But also another thing that I want to point out here is that this is very much Cletus Cassidy, because much like how we had seen Cassidy's Codex stick with a piece of the Carnage symbiote, which is what then kicked off Venom Island, this was then one of our earlier examples before King in Black, to where you had your case of someone who's bonded with the symbiote for a long time, they can navigate and do things that others couldn't. But then also for Cassidy, you have this extra thing to where his symbiosis through the years has been your perfect alignment between host and symbiote on top of that, because there's never been a stronger symbiosis between a host and a symbiote than that of Cletus Cassidy and the Carnage symbiote. But more of that's really explored and explained within Venom Island, because Cassidy had died again in absolute carnage when he had lost the Grendel that brought him back, but even still he continues on via his codex through the Carnage symbiote. And jumping back to Extreme Carnage, he kills the driver coming back from the airport. But then it's here where we jump over to Flash Thompson, who at this time, since we've seen him last in Venom issue 200, he's been working at a shelter and getting goods to veterans. And while he's here, he's working with this guy named Hank, who's also a veteran, but Hank also expresses that he feels like he could be doing more. And he admits in his this case, for Hank, the army really wasn't his thing, but in a lot of ways he misses the intensity that he used to see day to day. And it's here where he asks Flash if he remembers Laughlin, who's another vet who came back and got like an amazing job. High-end security detail for some celebrity pop star, and he gets to travel. But for Hank, he opens up to Flash and he tells him that he kind of wishes that he had landed a job a bit more exciting like Laughlin. And even still, Hank believes that helping other veterans is a great thing to do. But once again, Hank misses that intensity because there is always action. You're always keeping your guard up, looking over your shoulder, and keeping people safe. But while Hank and Flash are having this conversation, and Flash then starts to hear the radio all the way from the car ride with Cassidy. And when this happens, Flash closes his eyes and he opens them, and he's sitting in the passenger seat of that car with Cassidy at the wheel, but still using the Alchemax dude's body. But when this happens, of course, Flash, he's flipping out because he's like, how did I get here? And when he asks this dude like who he is, Cassidy responds that he's family, and Flash doesn't believe it because Cassidy's supposed to be dead. But Cletus then tells him that there's only dead people in this car. And as soon as he says that, Flash looks in the back seat to where the previous driver, he's back there and he's just torn to pieces. But initially with Flash seeing this, he's like, okay, like what did you do? From what he can tell, he killed one guy, took his body, killed another guy, took his car. And when he says this, Cassidy really messes with his head because he's like telling Flash like, you've done this before. And with saying this, he like forms out of this dude's mouth like straight out of a horror movie type stuff. But when Cassidy does this, he tells Flash like, come on Eugene, follow the pool. And with doing this, he's really trying to provoke Flash, or more or less agitate him to go on the offense, while also telling Flash that his family's waiting on him, referring to the symbiote family spawned from Venom that is waiting on Flash, and together they're going to change the world. But with Cassidy provoking Flash, and I think calling him Eugene is what did it, but with Cassidy provoking Flash, it's here that we find out that this whole time, Flash has been grabbing Hank and hallucinating this whole time, even to the point to where he nearly kills Hank. But fortunately, with Hank over here just screaming for his life and just yelling out Thompson, Thompson, Flash then snaps out of it and he lets Hank go, but not before going Agent Anti-Venom murder mode and nearly killing the guy. But because of this, Flash then takes off and then he runs right into Iron Man, who prior to this point had been looking for Flash, not to mention he had caught that little episode just now when Flash had nearly killed his buddy Hank. But with Tony finally finding Flash, it's here where he tells him that they both got a serious problem heading their way, if in fact it is not already there. But after this, we then jump over to a meeting which Cassidy had believed was going to be between this Alchemax representative and Senator Peter Crane, because prior to this point there had been an arrangement for the guardsmen to show up at a rally for the Friends of Humanity. And because of that, Cassidy was hoping to intercept Senator Crane, and likely with the intention of using his body like a puppet. But because Crane didn't show, and the body that Cassidy was currently using, he's pretty much worn out, and because of that, Cassidy kills almost everybody here and he saves one, so that he can then use this guy as a puppet more or less, so that he can get closer to Senator Crane. But after this, we then go back to Tony and Flash, to where Tony's brought Flash back to the lab to give him more details about this serious problem. But then it's here where Tony admits that he just refits the lab to whatever crisis that's going on at the moment, or as he would say, the crisis of the hour, which for quite some time now has been symbiotes. And even though Flash has been out of the loop for a minute, like that part he's already sure of. But also while they're here, Tony takes Flash to see his new Extrembiote, which was Tony's extremis infused symbiote that he had repurposed for one of those dragons during King in Black. And with seeing this, Flash tells Tony like, you know, controlling a symbiote is not like a thing you can do, like at least not in long term. Which also goes to show us that Tony has quite a bit to learn about symbiotes, and I'm sure he's gonna learn quite a bit like real quick, or at least throughout this series. But it's also here where Tony lets Flash know that the Extrembiote, that isn't why Tony brought Flash here. Because for Tony, since the conclusion of King in Black, he's been running scans for video footage all over the world so that he can then have a foot up on symbiote activity. And at this point, Tony's picked up a trail from like the past week of bodies that have been slaughtered with no sign of weapons, which is the same trail that we had seen Carnage create. And with Tony seeing this footage, he just shows this footage to Flash, telling him what he's seen and asking Flash what he thinks, without Tony giving any hints to his presumption, because he wants Flash's feedback. And it's almost like Tony knew who it was, but he just wanted to hear Flash say the name. And when Flash tells Tony that it's Cletus Cassidy, and Tony's like, no, Cletus is dead. And then it's here where Flash is like, okay Tony, let me school you again about how the symbiote thing works. And it's here where Flash tells Tony that Cassidy's consciousness is still alive, it's still in the hive. Which is an interesting concept, being that Eddie freed all the symbiotes from the hive, or from Knull's hive at least, with Eddie becoming the new hive unto himself. But it also begs the question, like, did that freedom or liberty also just leave a whole lot of power just on the table for Cassidy to tap into and just take advantage of? But at this point, Flash, he doesn't really go into all of that here, but instead he tells Tony what he had seen earlier when he had noticed Flash acting strange back when he saw Flash go into murder mode, to where he was being pulled by Cassidy and he spoke to him one-on-one. But also with seeing Cassidy, Flash noticed that Cassidy was stronger than he used to be. But at this point, he's not sure if it was because Cassidy was connected to Knull at one point, but with seeing all this, he's 100% positive that this is Carnage. And he remembers him mentioning that he's planning for something big. And with hearing that, Tony has a pretty good idea on what exactly that is. And as Tony breaks this down to Flash, we also see like the dude that Carnage had taken over making his way over to Senator Crane. But it's here where Tony tells Flash like the world is in a very volatile state, because even though the heroes saved the world countless times, like most of the time the general public knows nothing about it. But with Knull's invasion, it was something that was very public, and for that reason people are terrified. And he tells Flash how Senator Crane has stepped forward as the face for the Friends of Humanity, who Tony says that no one's taken serious in years. But because of this, Senator Crane is a target, and Tony tells Flash like if Carnage attacks Senator Crane, Crane is going to become a martyr, and that's going to set everything off in the worst way. But that's also the reason why Tony reached out to Flash, because he wants Flash to go in and get close and either warn Senator Crane or shadow him. Because if Carnage actually kills Senator Crane, then the Friends of Humanity, they're going to pretty much run everything. So for that reason, Flash has got to keep this guy alive no matter what it takes. And I feel like I've seen this in a movie. I don't know if it was X-Men or Terminator, but it feels familiar. But it's also here when Flash goes to Senator Crane's next event, which is pretty much being held to promote an upcoming Friends of Humanity event, since Crane doesn't have the support of the president and he's only running on his patrons. So with him asking everyone to come out, he wants to send a message to the president in order to make more things happen now, but also make his transition into the presidency a bit smoother later on. But while Flash is here, he hears the voice of Cassidy, who not only wants Flash to be here, but he also lets him know that he has a hive of his own, which is formed from other symbiotes that were spawned from the Venom symbiote, who are also here as well. But with Flash going back and forth with Cassidy, he's then spotted and he radios this to Tony and he gets out of there with the quickness. But with Flash leaving, Tony tells him that he needs to go back and protect Crane. But at this point, Flash truly believes that Crane has already been taken by Carnage. But then after this, we then catch up with Hank, Flash's friend who he's working with at the shelter, who's also the friend he almost killed. But it's here where Flash reaches out to Hank, who's rather cool about what happened the other day. But it's here where Flash asks him if he's serious about what he said before, about wanting to get back into the action and get into doing something that was meaningful. And it's here where Flash tells him that he needs a team to put together stateside of the capital, and he lets him know that it's also going to be way more dangerous than anything Hank had seen when he was deployed. And with doing this, Flash needs people that he can trust, and Hank tells him like without hesitation like he's in. And from there, Flash tells Hank to get himself like a black suit so he can do security detail, and that way he can go undercover for Senator Crane, who currently is hiring. And it's a pretty smart plan as far as getting inside early on while Crane is still building up. But also what's very dangerous about this is the fact that Crane is still promoting this huge event for the Friends of Humanity that's coming up in this next week, which is said on the surface to be about preserving humanity, whether versus the mutants or aliens. But if this event is a success and Crane gets like this huge turnout of people to go, and Cassidy has in fact taken over Crane, then this event is going to turn into a slaughter real quick. Because everybody who shows up at that event, they're going to be subject to Carnage and the other symbiotes that he has allied with him. Alright, so with Extreme Carnage Scream issue 1, for this entire issue we follow the current story of the current Scream, Andy Benton. And to get a better understanding of like where she's at recently, I'd heavily recommend for you to check out Planet of the Symbiotes issue 1, because there's a lot of references to that issue within this issue. And I got a link below if you need to be caught up, because at the time when we talked about Planet of the Symbiotes, we also did a quick little history catch up on Andy Benton as well. So that'll definitely get you caught up before you jump into reading Extreme Carnage Scream. But where we start off here is over at Alchemax Tower, to where for the most part Alchemax is notoriously known for a number of their shady genetic experiments, and when they're not creating something weird, they're probably holding it against his will and experimenting on it. But then it's here where we jump in, where we also find Doppelganger jumping out of the window. And like with Doppelganger, like the trail that led him to Alchemax, like I guess if you start around the time from Absolute Carnage, like towards the end of that he was taken to Ravencroft, and then when Ravencroft was raided by vampires, which I think took place in Jason Aaron's Avengers, but after that happened he was later apprehended and taken to Alchemax. And now it's here in Extreme Carnage where he's just like, hey, I can't do it anymore, Alchemax, I'm out. But also with him leaving Alchemax, he's immediately pursued by the Guardians, But as soon as Doppelganger hits the streets and he's fighting off these different Guardians, it's here where he's then spotted by Scream. And in the case of Scream, Andy Benton, like since King in Black, or even more so during the time of King in Black, for the most part she's been around like in the streets of New York, catching all the loose ends, and really just helping who she could on the ground level, like around the outskirts of the main battle of the main event, which eventually led to Eddie Brock defeating Knull. But it's here with Scream where she catches Doppelganger, and she literally stops him from killing this Guardian, but even with doing so, the Guardian calls for backup. But then between her and her symbiote, they kind of go over the idea of like, what if they flip this to where instead of the Guardians hunting symbiotes, symbiotes were instead hunting for them. And initially she starts to ask this guy like, why are the Guardians hunting for symbiotes? And all he tells her is that they've been instructed to keep an eye out for non-human activity. And he tells her like, that's it, like that's all you're getting out of me. But for Scream, that's fine by her because she just ends up killing the dude anyway. But really what's been happening here, like while Scream was talking to this Guardian, there's also been this thrumming sound that she heard, or more specifically that her symbiote heard, that was coming by a nearby Senator Kane broadcast. And with this happening, like Andy, she couldn't hear it, but her symbiote could. So initially Andy just thought her symbiote was getting into politics, but her symbiote then expressed that this thrumming sound was calling her to the family. And with this happening, she was then disoriented, which caused her to back up into the street, and immediately she's hit by a car. And it kind of had me thinking like, if you're a driver and you're paying attention to the road at least, and you see Scream standing to the side watching an ad, or watching a broadcast from the senator at least, that should at least call your attention to either make a U-turn or just take some other detour altogether. But with this whole thing happening and this thrumming sound coming out, which we know from Extreme Carnage Alpha, that this is more or less the sound of Carnage reaching out. But also with this happening, we get a separation between Andy and the Scream symbiote, with the symbiote responding to the call like, we gotta go, and Andy on the other hand trying to stop the symbiote. And when this happens, Andy, she tries to get the two of them at least somewhere isolated so that they can refocus and more or less like resync, so to speak. And because of that, Andy takes the two of them down in the sewer. But after they get down there, suddenly Andy realizes that she's not even in the sewer, but instead she's immediately taken into an illusion, to where in this illusion the symbiote's completely gone, and all of a sudden she's alone in the dark with Carnage. And it's here with seeing this that we find out that Carnage has pulled her into the hive. And when this happens, we get a little bit more information about how Carnage is doing this, when he tells Andy that it's funny what happens to a kingdom when you dispose of the king, because Knull used to rule this place and now Brock thinks that he does. But then it's also here where Cletus tells her that he was here first and he made this place his home while the storm was blowing over. And with them saying this, it's really just confirmation of what I assumed with the callback to Venom Island. And you can even go as far back as Absolute Carnage, because after Eddie killed Cassidy, who was effectively one with the symbiote, this only killed or re-killed Cassidy's physical body, because Eddie absorbed the Grendel that was keeping that body alive. But this also brought along Cassidy and springboarded into Venom Island, where Eddie borrowed a Quinjet from the Avengers so that him and his other could take Carnage to the Island of Bones, but Carnage made sure they were stranded. But it was also here where Cletus had hijacked the Venom symbiote and giving Eddie the option either to just give up, or Carnage would forcefully just take over his body and make Eddie watch everything through his own eyes with Cassidy in control. Because at the time we were also given the explanation, like with Cassidy dying so many times and him coming back, that he'd learned how to navigate through the hive much better than most. And really parts of this go back even further, with Cassidy and the symbiote having perfect symbiosis, on top of how long they've been in perfect symbiosis. But essentially from Carnage Born throughout Absolute Carnage, and furthermore in Venom Island, we had really been given this arc to where Cassidy, he had been navigating the hive, and even to the point to where he could use it to pull off new tricks, like imprisoning people and using their bodies. And this is more or less the long and short of what Cassidy is telling Andy when he lets her know that he has more experience in the hive, and that he was there first in relation to Eddie. And with the way that Cassidy says this, it's like Eddie may think that he's doing something, but he's really just new to all this, unlike Carnage, who has literally been visiting the hive since birth. And when he says this, like, first of all, it makes sense, but also it's like Eddie's gotta be careful, man, because with Venom 200 showing us like all the crazy things that Eddie can do, and now Cassidy's pretty much saying that he is to Eddie what Eddie was to Knull. Like, that's the new shift in the kingdom. Because if you think about it, back during the time of King in Black, the reason why Eddie was so dangerous to Knull is because he was the person who had been in the symbiote for the longest, which is what we were told going up to the finale of King in Black, before the Enigma Force dropped in and just made Eddie OP. But prior to that, Eddie's time in a symbiote was like the explanation to why he was such a credible threat to Knull before his power buff. So now that the original King Knull is gone and Eddie has taken his place, Carnage has now taken Eddie's place. But as usual with Carnage, there's many more tricks tricks up his sleeve. And for the time being with Carnage, a lot of these things are things that we've seen him do before. And because of that, his approach towards Eddie is going to be very different than Eddie's approach towards Knull. And I doubt the Enigma Force is coming back inside with Carnage. But with us getting this, it's interesting to see how it'll play out. But with Carnage pulling the Venom Island hive prison thing that he did with Eddie, like pulling it on Andy now, he then pulls the Venom Island symbiote body takeover on Andy in the Scream symbiote. But even with the Scream symbiote under the influence of Carnage and Andy Benton still in her hive prison, Andy still has a fighting chance here, even though she hasn't been in the Scream symbiote for that long. But even still with that being the case, she has her experience with the Mania symbiote, which for a host, like that counts as experience, much how like Rex explained with Eddie and him being in the Venom symbiote for so long. But for the time being on the outside, like the backup Guardians, they've showed up, but when they get there, Carnage is using Scream to just destroy these guys. And it's crazy seeing this happen because Carnage is very much using a combination of Scream's style as well as his own, and it's like these guys don't even stand a chance. But inside the hive between Andy and the Scream symbiote, and she's trying to tell the symbiote like not to follow Carnage, but the pull from Carnage to the Scream symbiote, like it's just way too strong. And it's because of this where Andy, she has to go to her last resort and she has to use her Hellmark, which she had got from Flash back when she first became Mania, and with using this, it'll allow her to burn her way free. But even still, she's cautious with using this because she doesn't want to harm the Scream symbiote, because even prior to now, she's been using the Hellmark with the Scream symbiote, and it didn't harm the Scream symbiote before because Andy was protecting it, and at the time, she didn't allow the Hellfire to harm the Scream symbiote because up to this point, they were working together, which essentially is the same concept of why when Ghost Rider or any Ghost Rider picks a vehicle, like it just doesn't melt. Or at least that's the way I've looked at it for the longest, like either with Andy or anyone else who has been temporarily either given the Hellmark or has used Hellfire at their own discretion. But with Andy doing this and breaking her way free, like the Scream symbiote, like it feels it. But effectively, this also allows Andy to regain consciousness, and when she does, immediately Cletus uses this against her, and he tells the Scream symbiote, like, look, I told you, your host is no good, and all she's gonna do is try to hurt you. And sadly, like the Scream symbiote buys into this. And it's not so much because the Scream symbiote just trusts Carnage over Andy, but it's also the fact, like, the influence of Carnage, like it's heavily skewing the Scream symbiote's judgment. So immediately when Andy regains control of her body, the Scream symbiote starts to choke her out and pull her back in. But then in an act of desperation, Andy just lets off a Hellmark blast, incinerating the Scream symbiote and setting herself free. And with doing so, she gets rid of Cassidy, but she also kills the Scream symbiote. And it's really a bit of a heartbreaking moment. But then as she's here grieving, one of the Guardians then puts his hand on her shoulder. And when this happens, I'm like, man, like this looks like one of those moments where you just clock out and you let the company take it from there. Because when you see this girl just catch on fire, you just be like, you know what? This looks like a job for management. Let me get out the way. But no, this particular Guardian, he's one of those guys who would just take a bullet for the company. And like everybody knows that coworker, like this dude, like he takes it. He takes his job way more serious than he should. And for that reason, in this moment, he literally catches hell for it, or hellfire for that matter. But when this happens, Andy, she initially screams, stay away from us, or don't come near us. But then after getting this guy out the way, she's like, leave me alone. Because she realizes that she's truly by herself, and the little bit that remains of the Scream symbiote, it's non-responsive. But the other Guardians, they also show up, and they've come to take what's left of the Scream symbiote back with them to Alchemax. Alright, so where this starts back, it picks up as a bit of a continuation from Planet of the Symbiotes issue 1, where we had last seen Phage along with Lasher, Agony, and Riot, and it's in this issue where we only get a pickup to where like Phage has been since then, because from that time when they all had tried to devour Scream while under the influence of Knull, and Scream just blasted her way out with her Hellmark, since then these guys have been separated. And as we follow Phage with this one, it kind of feels like we're going to get the story of the others picking up from the same cliffhanger throughout the course of Extreme Carnage. But as we pick up with Phage, we come to find out that since King in Black, Phage has opted for the more simple life, because it's here where we find Phage, who is bonded with Mitch, who's Buck Cashman's dog, to where all he really does here is just hunt with Buck, eat, sleep, and call it a day. And prior to now, I'm not sure we talked about Buck Cashman before, just off the top of my mind, I doubt it, but he's pretty much ex-military, used to work with Kingpin, fought against Daredevil, which is automatic if you ever worked for Kingpin. Like as soon as you hire, Daredevil just jumps out and punches you in the face. But from here, jumping forward to now, it's here where we see them watching Senator Crane's announcement, which as we've seen before, Carnage is using to reach out to his hive, and amongst his hive going for family first. And much like we'd seen with Scream, Phage is taken over by this thrumming sound, which makes its way through the broadcast, which makes Phage go crazy, and as a result, he turns on Buck and he tears this dude to pieces. But in this case, the only thing I would say is different from what we'd seen with Scream or with Flash is that we don't see Mitch go into the hive with the whole dreamscape thing. And I guess it's really not needed here, but it would have been funny just to see him just appear before Carnage in his hive and Carnage just be like, sit, ubu sit, good dog. But it really wasn't needed because we get the idea with just seeing the Senator and with us knowing by way of Flash like what Carnage is up to. But then after this we then go over to Andy Benton shortly after she destroyed the Scream symbiote out of desperation, and while she's mourning over the remains of Scream which are unresponsive, she's then approached by a group of the guardsmen and they tell her that Alchemax owns the right to all non-human matter, which is a bit of a tricky statement, but essentially they're telling Andy that they want the remains of the Scream symbiote, the ashes that are on Andy's body, and anything that still remains within Andy's system left over from the symbiote. But I also gotta say, like, this whole thing with Alchemax saying like they own the rights to all non-human matter, it kind of reminds me of some news I saw the other day with Lil Uzi Vert, who just bought a planet. And the first thing I thought when I saw it was like, okay, first of all, who owns that planet? Like, who'd he buy it from? And when I seen it, man, I was like, man, if that don't sound like a scam, bro, like. And I'm sure when he bought it, he got like legal documentation, but it just tickles me to think about just humans looking out far, seeing a planet and be like, ooh, I'm gonna put that up for sale. And then somebody buys it. But who knows, hundreds of years from now, his great-great-great-grandchildren may benefit from it. And either that or a more superior race will come across it, or it may have locals who just don't want their planet taken. And at that point, hopefully Lil Uzi can get a refund. But either way, I digress. But then it's here where Andy's distracted by one of the guardsmen, who she tells that he's doing this for the money, but then he tells her that he's doing this to protect his son, to keep him safe from invading aliens, and when this happens, Andy is shocked and taken into custody. But also with this happening, it also feels like this guardsman who mentions his son, like it's the same guardsman that we saw in Planet of the Symbiotes, issue 3. Where we also got the reveal that this guardsman is the father of Brent Waters, who's the new host for the Toxin symbiote. But even with mentioning this, like, I'm not 100% sure that this is the same guy, but just solely going off the dialogue exchange here, it does kind of feel like some good old character building that's happening, while also setting us up for Toxin to appear later on in Extreme Carnage. But then after Andy's taken, we then head over to Alchemax, to where she wakes up in her containment, and the first person she sees is Dr. Steven. And Dr. Steven, who is head of Alchemax astrobiology department, he's been at Alchemax since forever. Like, I don't think he's leaving the company. But Dr. Steven has always been like your symbiote expert, and it's here where he tells Andy, who understandably is upset because she's in containment, but he gets her to calm down because he lets her know that he's trying to help the Scream symbiote, or at least what's left of it at this point. And with telling her this, he lets her know like he's quite familiar with helping people who have been in a similar position, like we've seen him do for Eddie in the Venom symbiote, which had later inadvertently brought us to the creation of Anti-Venom. But he doesn't go into all that, he just lets her know that he's here to help. But right after this, we then go over to Flash, who we see stopping this guy from stealing someone's phone by using a symbiote to just trip this guy up and just catch the phone. But it's with doing this where Flash gets the update about what happened to Andy and that she's been taken to Alchemax. But then it's also here we find out that Buck Cashman is private detail for Senator Crane. And when he comes to Alchemax demanding that Andy Benton's treatment is immediately under his oversight, this is a huge curveball for a number of reasons. Cause for one, we saw this dude just die. And as far as him working for Senator Crane, like that wouldn't be too far of a twist if the opening scene wasn't him getting his throat ripped out. But with him coming back here with no pupils and a yellow shirt, you kind of know what's going on. And it isn't long before he gets right to it. Because as soon as he goes in, he heads for Andy Benton's containment unit, and even though Andy doesn't necessarily recognize Buck, it really isn't long before she realizes that who all she's really dealing with him calling her a traitor and then telling her that he's here for payback. And it's here where Andy discovers that Carnage has gotten to Phage, but then also that Phage wants payback for what had happened the last time that him and Andy had met, as well as for what she did to the Scream symbiote. But also, I just gotta point out that this combination between Carnage and Phage, it looks like the best pair of Air Maxes that I ever seen. Like, I'm really digging the colorway here. But it's here where Phage also tells Andy that Carnage had saved him, like he's saving the rest of the symbiotes with his call, and he's here to make Andy pay for her quote-unquote attack on Scream, which had kept Scream from answering the call and joining the others. But while this is happening, we then jump over to Dr. Steven, who's being chewed out by Dr. Leonida, who's head of the Guardsman program, but he's upset with Dr. Steven for taking Andy and the Scream symbiote. But for Dr. Steven, it only makes sense that he would, being that he's the symbiote expert and head of astrobiology, and because of that, there's really little there to argue with. But their conversation is cut short when an alarm goes off, which was triggered by Phage. But also, with this alarm going off, which causes Dr. Leonida to leave, it also doubles as a cover for Flash Thompson when he comes crashing in and paying Dr. Steven a visit, which was great planning on Flash's part. But also when Flash just crashes in, looking like murder was the face that they gave me, but with him coming here, he's not here to hurt or harm Dr. Steven in any way, because he knows for a fact that Dr. Steven is not going to harm Andy, like he just knows that off of his history. But with Flash showing up here, like for one, it's obvious that he's looking for Andy. But then on top of that, like the look on Dr. Steven's face when he sees that Flash is alive, like that is literally the face you make when you've seen a ghost. But at this point, Dr. Steven, he's not even aware of like the full details of what happened in King in Black. So this is the first time he's seen Flash in a long time. So to put it modestly, he's a bit shook. But it's also funny because he didn't budge when the Xeno alert went off, like, and that happens all the time. But then when he saw Flash, it was like 2 drops of pee came out. But when Flash gets here and he asks where's Andy, Dr. Steven tells him like just follow the screams, which very much feels like a pun, but I'll take it. But then also it's here while Andy's going up against your Phage/Carnage combination that we find out that Andy's Hellfire from her Hellmark, that it no longer works on Phage, which in this case is kind of just a perk that he got from Carnage. And when seeing this, it immediately reminds me of like one of you guys in the last video, you were asking like when is Carnage going to complete his skill tree? Like this guy just keeps pulling tricks out of the bag. And I feel like even though it may not necessarily be new tricks all the time, but it seems like the bag is bottomless. But even on top of that, as crazy as stuff looks in Extreme Carnage, a lot of these things that he's been doing, they've been set up in previous stories. So it's really like Carnage is doing the same tricks, but as of late, whenever there's a shift as far as how symbiotes and their powers work, as a result, Carnage, he just tries all his tricks again, and now they work differently because everything else has changed. But then it's here where Phage grabs Andy and talks about like her history, how she's been abandoned, and we even get references to how Carnage killed her aunt, and Phage really tries to rub in the whole idea of Andy being alone. But then it's here where Flash steps in, telling Phage that it's over, and Phage lets him know like this isn't over till I say it's over. And he just tosses Andy out of her containment room. And when this happens, immediately Flash is worried about Andy because that's a hard hit. But also in the case of Phage, Flash understands that he's being pulled by Carnage. So Flash then tries to reason with Phage, more or less telling him that we can't let Carnage just pull another Knull on us. But when Flash says this, Phage just tells him like no. Carnage is after blood for our hive, and Phage just cuts past Flash and he impales Andy. And it's crazy, like Extreme Carnage, this is what we doing? Somebody gonna die in every issue? And in the case of Scream, she died twice. Technically. But with seeing it end this way, like it very much makes me think of like the moment when Andy had became Mania, because back then Flash failed to protect her father from Jack-o'-lantern, or better yet at the time, the Jack-o'-lantern imposter. But also at the time, in order to save her life, he covered her with the Agent Venom suit to where part of it bonded with her and she became Mania. And it kind of feels like we're being set up with this cliffhanger, like in a way to kind of get the version of that with the anti-Venom suit. Alright, so with Extreme Carnage Lasher, this picks up immediately from the cliffhanger of Extreme Carnage Phage, with what seemed to be like an instant kill from your Carnage possessing Phage symbiote who was sent to Alchemax to seek revenge on Andy Benton. But of course this is one of those things with fictional stories and not just comic books, but it's one of those things where depending on how significant you are to either the story, or in other cases if you're just someone who the fans love, because in that case then you're somebody who'll just live forever. But in this case with Andy, who uses her Hellmark to push Phage back, her Hellmark, which she had got from Flash Thompson when she became Mania, it buys her a few more seconds of time, but even still she's in that finish her state where she can barely do anything. But then when Phage goes to kill Andy, which again in the case of Phage is more so Carnage pulling the strings, but before Phage can deliver the killing blow, he's held off by Flash, who is then approached by the Guardsman, which in itself is something kind of funny because with Phage being the one going on the murder streak and Flash trying to stop him, the Guardsmen instead still go for Flash. And in this case you can tell they're going for the least scariest threat, and Flash picks that up like right away. and as a result, one of these guys just gets their head slapped off because that's the kind of thing that happens when you turn your back on the most dangerous person in the room. Like, what was that guy expecting? But then it's after this when we catch up with Lasher, who from the last time we had seen him in Planet of the Symbiotes, when at the time he was still along with the other Life Foundation symbiotes and also under the influence of Knull. But after he was defeated by Andy Benton, who was Scream at the time, this had then separated him from the other Life Foundation symbiotes, Phage, Riot, and Agony. But since then, with him free now, he's been kind of carving his own path, and from what we find when we pick up with him here, he's been jumping from host to host and really just trying to find a less violent way of life for himself. But when we catch up with him here, we find him at a nursing home, bonding with this elderly man by the name of William, who's likely suffering from dementia. But as soon as Lasher bonds with him, it turns out that William was watching Arthur Crane on a broadcast, which, like we'd seen before, Carnage has been using in order to call other symbiotes to head to Washington DC and make their way and rally over to him. And when this happens and the thrumming sound starts coming through the television, this immediately then pulls on Lasher, who tries to resist, but with attempting to resist and telling Carnage that he doesn't want a part in his cause, this then presents the case to where Carnage bypasses Lasher and he makes his way to appeal to William and manipulate him in order to make Lasher go to DC. But also while this is happening, and Carnage is just using Phage to make guardsmen kebabs over at Alchemax, because when you have your own hive, multitasking is definitely just a thing. But with all of these guardsmen occupied by force and not choice, it's here where Flash then takes the opportunity to snatch up Andy, who's barely hanging on to life, and rush her over to Dr. Steven so that he can hopefully help. But with making his way to Dr. Steven, there's really no time to explain what happened because she could go at any minute. And with bringing her here, Flash asks, like, is there anything left of her Scream symbiote? Because if she can just get like the smallest shred, then that alone could possibly save her life. But then it's here where Dr. Steven tells Flash that the Scream symbiote was damaged beyond repair. And like we'd seen before with him trying to help the symbiote, the most that he could do was splice it with another, which in this case what he had were samples of Flash's anti-venom symbiote. And when he tells this to Flash, it immediately comes as a shocker. But while Flash is talking to Dr. Steven and trying to figure this out, Andy, who literally has a burning hellhole in her chest, she just takes matters into her own hands and she reaches for Scream and breaks it out of the glass canister, because at this point she really just doesn't have the time to sit through a lecture of the specific intricacies of what Dr. Stevens needed to do to keep Scream alive. But when she breaks the glass container open and they start to bond, it's here where she then finds out that her symbiote isn't quite what it used to be. But now, due to Scream's genetic splicing with antivenom, the symbiote now introduces itself to Andy as the absence of Scream, the negative space of noise, the sound of silence, which from here moving forward is pretty much going to be her new identity. And with this happening, it feels very fitting, and mainly with Andy Benton being the most recent Scream host and her history being tied so close to Flash, so with her getting an anti-venom like change in a very similar way to the way Flash got his, like, it just makes sense. But then as far as the whole naming thing, with her name now being Silence, that part I think I'm gonna need some time to grow on me, because as soon as I heard the name Silence, I couldn't help but think of Dragonfly saying silence. So I'm just gonna need a little bit of time to push that out and welcome this in. That's all. But then also at this time, in the case of William, who's the current host of Lasher, like, it's here where we see him pulled more or less into Carnage's hive, to where Carnage causes him to believe that he's seeing his wife Susie. And with the way that this is done and how Carnage is just trying to appeal to William's thoughts and his memories, Carnage also then offers to restore William's lost memories and more or less cure his ailment. And with Lasher trying to help William and tell him, like, don't listen to Carnage, he's just using you. But William doesn't listen and he accepts Carnage's offer, to where with doing so, on the outside, like in the real world, William is just creating a path of destruction using the Lasher symbiote while also following what he believes to be an image of his wife, when in actuality it's really Carnage luring William out to DC, which is really where it gets messed up, because along the way, Carnage takes William to find his son, and with doing so, Carnage just uses him to impale this kid. But also when this happens, we find out through Lasher that along this journey, William's physical body has already died. But with William accepting Carnage's offer and letting him in, this allowed Carnage to use William's memories as a tool for William to bring him Lasher, and at this point that's something that William just can't take back. But then from here, going closer to the time where everything's going crazy at Alchemax with Flash, Andy, and Phage, this chaos then also makes the news, and with doing so it gets the attention of Brent Waters, who's your current host of the Toxin symbiote. And luckily he caught this breaking news after changing the channel from watching like the Muppets version of Endgame, which even in the case of that program, it looked like it was a subliminal coming from Carnage. But with Brent seeing that Alchemax was under attack, he immediately rushed out to help his dad, because like we had seen in Planet of the Symbiotes, his dad is one of the guardsmen. But as far as Brent making his way to Alchemax, that's more so something addressed in the next issue, because when we jump over to Alchemax here, we just jump right into Silence going after Phage, which again is Phage/Carnage. But with how this goes down, and Carnage likely at this point assuming that Andy's dead, so when Silence now steps out and she just goes to putting the smack down on Phage, this immediately has Carnage like, who are you supposed to be? With him also assuming that she's just another lab rat from Alchemax who had likely just escaped. But with Silence going up against this version of Phage, she does get a bit dramatic with the monologue, and with doing so she uses her newly found anti-venom properties and she just slaps him on the top lip with the bubble shush, while telling him that Silence is golden and then using her hair to just thwip him out the window. And when she does this, in a way I kind of feel like it's a bit of foreshadowing, with it kind of showing us that this new character that she's become, how it's going to be a mixture of both anti-venom and Scream, but then also that's just another thing that we'll kind of just have to see over the course of time. But in the case of Phage, with him falling out the building, like when he hits the ground, it's here where he's then approached by Mitch once again, who catches the scent of his original owner and he goes to lick the wounds, and it's right then when Phage just bonds to him again. But also at this point where you have this new Andy who had just recently bonded with this questionable new symbiote, and when this happens, it's here where Flash kind of has a moment to where he's not really sure if Andy is aware or she's really in there. But then check this out. So when Flash approaches her and he asks her, Andy, are you okay? And when I first read this, I gotta confess, for a solid 3 minutes, I started singing, Andy, are you okay? Are you okay? And y'all probably think I'm playing, but it got bad. Like, it went up, I went through the hook and everything. Like, I don't understand. I was like, are you okay, Andy? Like, I got up and started clapping. Yeah, like, I had a moment. But like with what's happening here, we also kind of have this lingering case of suspicion to where Flash isn't sure if this is actually Andy or any likeness of Scream for that matter. And when she doesn't respond and she's actually silent, now it really leaves Flash to wonder who exactly he's dealing with. But then also as all of this draws to a close, we then go over to DC to where we find that Lasher has made his way there. And at this point with William, who is the host, who mind you, again, he has been dead for some time at this point, but with his brain still working, he tells Carnage to put him down, and Carnage just drops his dead body right in front of the Lincoln Monument. And when this happens, what's left of William, which is really just the memory or the codex at this point, he then asks Carnage like, how is he still alive? And it's here where Carnage tells him, well, you know, you have your cases where the body may fail, but the mind will keep going. And with saying this, he tells William that he appreciates him bringing Lasher back to him and reuniting him with his kin, so to speak. And with saying this, he tells William more or less that he's going to do him the same favor. And with saying this, he just discards William, allowing him to die so that he can literally be reunited with his family. And after that, we then go back to one of Crane's speeches, which Carnage has been using to get out to the rest of the symbiotes, who in this case I believe are just either his siblings, as far as offsprings from the Venom symbiote, and his own offspring, which it appears at this point like that's what his hive is limited to. But with the scene of speech from Crane, which is practically Carnage, it's centered around of how the people will not be silenced anymore, and with those choice words, it kind of sounds like shots being thrown at Andy in her new symbiote. Alright, so jumping back in, we start off with Hank, and if you guys remember, Hank is Flash's friend, ex-military, retired, worked with Flash for a while at the shelter, who had also expressed to Flash that he wanted to get back into doing something with a bit more intensity. So when Flash later asked for his help to go undercover as security for Senator Crane, he immediately jumped at the opportunity, and doing so with being well aware of the risk that he's getting into, and really with the exception of him knowing that Senator Crane has actually been taken over by Carnage. But with him watching Senator Crane under the instructions of Flash telling him to keep close tabs and let Flash know what Crane is up to where from there Hank has seen a number of people who has sponsored Senator Crane and the Friends of Humanity, whether it be in the open or through dirty dealings. But then on top of that, with him being so close, he also notices that there's something strange about Senator Crane, with how he looks at him like a shark that's just ready to bite. But then on top of that, the guy barely breathes or blinks, which really on one hand, you can't really jump into conclusions with seeing stuff like that, because there's some people in real life who are like that and they don't have stowaway symbiotes. Or they might, I don't know. But in the case of Hank, who has very little experience with symbiotes, like he's none the wiser. And not long after, he's saved from this awkward is the senator gonna eat me type of moment when the senator's son Arthur mentions that their big guest is on the way and if he should go pick him up. But instead of having Arthur go, Senator Crane sends Hank to go and pick up their VIP guest. And so at this point, going back earlier in the day over at Alchemax, and it's here where Flash is trying to make sure that Andy is okay. And I'm not gonna do it this time, like I promised. But with Flash asking, he just wants to make sure, because this whole last minute bonding to save Andy's life, like that whole situation was real questionable. Oh, and just to be clear before I forget, because I noticed a bit of confusion in the comments on the last video, because with this new symbiote, it's made of what was left from Scream mixed with the anti-venom serum. So when Dr. Stevens told Flash that he had mixed what was left of Scream with another symbiote, so he then went on to say yours, he didn't literally mean Flash's symbiote, but instead the same anti-venom serum that was produced from your original anti-venom, which again is the same serum that had inadvertently created Flash's symbiote. So again, it's not directly from Flash, because up until now, Dr. Stevens didn't even know that Flash was alive. But with Flash questioning this whole new symbiote situation, he then tells Silence that he needs to speak to Andy just to know that she's in there. And when he asks, she shows her face just to let him know that she's still there. So with speaking to her directly, he knows now that it wasn't like an evil symbiote takeover or nothing. Because prior to this, the only thing that was like for sure was that this new Silence combination with Andy and the new symbiote is that they were willing to put the hurt on Carnage and Phage. But now he knows Andy's in control and she's good. But then right away with Dr. Steven, with him seeing the new outcome with Andy and the symbiote, he already has a ton of questions as far as like how is Silence different from Scream. Like he wants to know everything about this brand new creation. But at this point, when another alarm goes off and more Alchemax security is on their way, this really isn't the best time, and because of that, Andy and Flash, they just gotta get out of there. But just after they get out of there, it's here where Flash goes over his plan with Andy, and when she hears it, she pretty much hates it. Because for starters, Andy, she doesn't even know who Hank is. None of us do. But just from going off of what Flash tells her, it's like, okay, well this guy didn't do too well in the military, and he's your man on the inside who's supposed to find this magic anti-Carnage bullet. But then it's here where Flash tells her like, no, the anti-Carnage bullet, that's you. And Flash tells her like, look at what she did with Phage. Which one of you guys had me rolling, because you were talking about the whole finger on the lip thing, and you were saying Phage was defeated by a bum bump. And really, you're not wrong, because that's practically what happened. But with Flash breaking down the idea of Andy being the anti-Carnage bullet, because what she did was huge, because she effectively separated Phage from the hive. And with using this method, in theory she could isolate Carnage and take the fight to him directly, which immediately spooks Andy, because she remembers recently with Scream, when Carnage reached out trying to pull the Scream symbiote into its hive, or by way of his hive, it was way different than any of her encounters with Carnage before. But instead it was like the Scream symbiote was being pulled off of instinct. But then here we're jumping over to a bus that's leaving Chicago, and it's here where we pick up with the Riot symbiote, who in its case we don't get too much of an idea of what it's been doing since King in Black, but with just kind of going off of what we're presented with here, it pretty much seems almost like Lasher, who is also kind of just hopping around and moving around from different hosts in order to survive. But unlike Lasher, who was only looking for like people on their deathbed, Riot is hopping around looking for whoever, because it still hasn't decided to take like that moral high ground more or less. And when we see it here about the bomb of this random guy on this bus, it's here where Riot then runs into Carnage, who easily makes this connection directly to Riot, and he draws him in like with no resistance or nothing. But even with seeing this here, it's possible that Carnage could have started wheeling in Riot before this by using the usual broadcast from Senator Crane, like just to get him on the bus, but we're not showing that here. But instead we just hop in from the bus to the moment where Carnage connects to Riot through the hive, to where he then sends Riot to go through each and every person on this bus until Riot finds a host that's just right, before making his way over to DC. And at this point over with Flash and Flash let Andy know, like, I've seen you as Scream, I've seen you as Silence, and I've seen you as Andy. And he tells her that he knows that she can do this, and she's more or less like she'll give it a try, but if it goes bad, he can't say that she didn't warn him. But when she then goes into the hive to connect to Carnage and draw him out, there's nothing. Like, it's completely empty. She doesn't sense anyone else there. And initially she tells Flash that it's possible that Dr. Steven could have broken something when he had turned what was left of Scream into Silence, or perhaps the connection is tainted somehow, how she can't get through. But even still, with this being the case, she tries again, and with her trying harder, she remembers what the different symbiotes feel like, and with reaching out this time, she tries to feel for them, but she doesn't feel any of them. And just like before, it's much like she's floating in the void by herself, but this time with her trying to reach out to Eddie or Carnage or any of the Life Foundation symbiotes, it's way more taxing on her this time physically than if she were to just connect to the void. And when she does this and Flash sees like her nose is bleeding, he gets her to stop because he feels like he's been pushing her too hard, and he lets her know, take a break, we'll try again later, but Andy just tells him no, she's not gonna quit. But then it's after this where we catch up with the bus that we had seen leaving Chicago, only to find that it has arrived in DC, and it's here where we see that Riot, he's the special guest or the VIP who Senator Crane had been talking about and who he had sent Hank to go pick up, which now checks Riot off the list for Carnage's family invitation to slaughter the nation. But with Senator Crane sending Hank to go pick up Riot, it does almost feel like Hank, he's potentially in a bit of danger of becoming a double agent if Carnage has truly caught on to what Hank's doing. And I'm not saying it's something that will happen, because as of right now, there's only one other issue after this that's out right now, and without getting into it just yet, it doesn't seem that way. But it just crossed my mind, and I think it would be a pretty sick twist if it happened. But after this one, we then jump back over to Andy and Flash, where at this point with Flash seeing how drained Andy is, to where he's like, look, let's leave, we'll try something else. But then as they're leaving, it's here where Andy, she does feel something in the void, as if it's the presence of another symbiote who has just recently shown up on her radar. And so when she then reaches for it to kind of solidify and figure out who it might be, and as soon as she does this, like the first thing going through my mind is like, oh man, this looks a lot like Riot with the Carnage head. But as she grabs a hold trying to figure out who this is, we quickly then find out that it was Toxin, who had decided to drop in after noticing a faint tug from Andy in the void just after he had separated himself from Carnage. And we'll get into more about that in the next one. Alright, so for this one, we go back a bit from where we had left off with part 5, and as we make our way through, there's a point where the cliffhanger will then intersect with the narrative and then just move on from there, because before we really get into the toxic team-up portion, we first got to get into his most recent encounter with Carnage, which started off much like the rest, as far as being broadcast through the television by messages from Senator Crane, but in this case with Toxin, he's not compelled as strongly as the others that we've seen, if at all really, and a lot of that stems back from Toxin being the 1000 symbiote and him being stronger, which at this point in time with him being bonded to Bren, there's really that question of how close is he to being back to his full potential. But with him acknowledging the drum beat coming through Senator Crane's message, and instead of being uncontrollably compelled, he's more or less just like, what's that? Like he hears these drums but they're not booming. But with hearing this message from Crane, with them talking about the people needing protection and aliens being dangerous, and Bren's dad more or less agrees with that part, and when Bren asks him, is like that what you're doing at Alchemax, and his dad just brushes him off, and it's here where you kind of get this comment from Toxin where he notices the dynamic between Bren and his father, and he also notices that it's not the best, and when Toxin's kind of like, well, some dad you got there, I would know, and when he says that, I'm kind of like, between Carnage and Oscar, like, it's not really a comparison like that, because on one hand you got a serial killer versus a single dad who's like trying to do his best, and sure, he's not a great communicator, but he's not Carnage. But then it's here where we jump a lot closer to the more current events, but still closer around the time where Phage had attacked Alchemax. And with Brent knowing that Alchemax has recently been attacked, he rushes to make his way down there out of concern for his dad, who he still believes is just a security guard. But when he says this, Toxin tells him like, look, ain't nobody at Alchemax just a security guard. And with saying this really to give Bren a heads up, because last time that they ran into a guardsman, it was pretty hectic. So just to kind of warn Bren and protect him, Toxin's more or less telling Bren to steer clear of the guardsman, more so than trying to talk him out of going to help his dad. But along the way there, Bren then calls for Toxin to come out so that they can swing there a lot quicker, but all of a sudden Toxin just goes silent. And it's right away from here where we then see Toxin in the void, and right away when he finds himself there and he hears the drums again, right away he knows he's dealing with Carnage. And he lets Carnage know, like, even if he didn't hear the drums, like, the place is littered with his work, so it's pretty obvious that it's him. But since they've last met, Toxin was pretty sure that Eddie had killed Carnage, which was pretty much the ongoing belief since the conclusion of Absolute Carnage, but then that idea was debunked going into Venom Island. And really it's here where we find out that Toxin, he just wasn't aware of much of that, because the last time when he had faced Carnage, or really more so Carnage and Chthon, that battle had left Toxin weakened and to the point to where most had thought he was dead. But with Toxin actually hearing the voice of Carnage, that truly confirms that it is him, and Carnage responds letting him know that Eddie's way too busy to even sense what Carnage has been doing, with him being preoccupied on the universal level, and in Eddie's case likely even less now, with his recent changes and also his focus turning towards Dylan. villain, with Dylan becoming the new Venom, which again is another one of those explanations to why we haven't seen either Dylan or Eddie at this point. But one of the things to check out here is like when Carnage tries to forcefully induct Toxin into his hive, and with doing this you can tell that Carnage is really trying to down talk or psych him out more or less, and he tries to tell him things like he's weak and he couldn't survive on his own, and really that's one of those things that just couldn't be further from the truth. Because also with the last time that Toxin and Carnage had met up, to where Toxin was combined with both Jubilee Van Scotter's symbiote and the Ray's symbiote in order to stop Chthon, which eventually ended with what seemed to be the death of all three symbiotes, but as it appears Toxin was the only one who was able to recover, to where he had then eventually found Bren. But the fact that Toxin made it, even in a weakened state, like that alone should say something. But even with Carnage talking down Toxin's previous host and current host and telling Toxin how none of them had really given him a spine, and it's here where Toxin tells Carnage that him and Bren are more like a team rather than Carnage who's just like this crazed symbiote. But with saying that, like it's here where I want to talk a bit about what's being set up, or at least what appears to be in the works here. Because in the case of the Carnage symbiote, to where with Cletus Cassidy, it was like your first example of perfect symbiosis. And Eddie in the beginning was close when he hated Peter Parker, but even at that time the Venom symbiote didn't hate Peter Parker. Like it was pissed at him, but it didn't hate him. So with the Venom symbiote and Eddie combining that rage with hatred, their bond was way crazier and way stronger. But when the Venom symbiote gave birth to the Carnage symbiote and it then bonded with Cletus Cassidy, it was psycho, he was psycho, and that perfect symbiosis made him too much for either Venom or Spider-Man individually. But in the case of Toxin, who Carnage had feared from Toxin's birth, he's been a heavy threat even though he's never had perfect symbiosis. So imagine how much his power would buff in the event that he does. Because even when he was bonded initially with Patrick Mulligan, Carnage gave Mulligan the symbiote just to hold it for a while so he can kill him later. And even then after, between Toxin and Mulligan, it was more so the case of him trying to teach the symbiote to be good. But now we have the case of Brandon Waters being the current host, and up to this point there's been a bit of a heavy emphasis on the two of them having father issues, with Toxin's father being Carnage, and there's your issue right there, but then also Bren's issue with the communication with his dad, and him also being a guardsman, which feels like it's also building up to something later on. That's just gonna be super dramatic, and it's gonna bring Bren and Toxin even closer. And with that said, like once again, imagine Toxin at full power and with perfect symbiosis. Like he's gonna be a problem. And it really feels like we're walking the lines of seeing that being set up. But with Carnage continuing to threaten Toxin, and doing so with telling him things like, well, if he doesn't willingly join him, then he's gonna lobotomize him and make him do it, but that just doesn't happen. And instead, in mid-sentence, he just rips his jaw off. But again, with this taking place in the void, this is really more of a display of will more so than it is physical feats. But then also with Toxin putting up this fight this well, it is a bit of show of power, because naturally Carnage should be destroying Toxin here because the amount of time that him and Cletus has spent bonded together versus Toxin, who again is just learning everything as he goes and quite literally just hasn't been around as long. But with the two of them fighting back and forth in the void, Carnage then gives Toxin another ultimatum and he tells him to willingly join the hive, and with doing so, first eat Bren from the inside out, and if not, he'll hold Toxin here and Carnage will just do it himself. And for Bren, who's still trying to make his way to get to his dad, even though he's not able to hear Toxin, he does feel a bit of this struggle between Toxin and Carnage, but Bren just doesn't know what's going on. But just before Carnage can kind of make the decision for Toxin, and Toxin tells him right away, not this time, not with Bren. And from there, he just overthrows Carnage in the void, and he does so by eating him with the head that he had ripped off, and it effectively ends this whole encounter. And in the case of Carnage, though he lost here during this match in the void, he then tells Toxin that he's going to be a part of the bloodbath to come. And Toxin just lets him know, like, if he beat him here, then he'll beat Carnage on the outside too. But really, we know that's something that's not quite guaranteed, because in the void, you have your place where some may have their advantages, like someone's codex for example, who may be able to maneuver through the void, but then otherwise in the real world, they would then need a significant amount of help. And in the case of Toxin, that may be just his host, Bren, or it'll be the collective effort from the others. But even with seeing this at this point, I'm not really sure if Toxin's at 100%. But after this, then going to Bren as he makes his way over to Alchemax, and as soon as he gets there, he sees his father being taken out on a stretcher. And at this point, his dad's been taken out of his armor, so it's not like he's in his guardsman suit. And so when Bren runs up to him and he tells him that a symbiote that did this, Bren still doesn't even know. And when he directly asks his father if he is a guardsman, his dad pretty much just denies it. And not even so much in the way of outright just lying about it, but he deflects the question and he tells Bren, like, you think I need one of them green suits? When apparently he does, because if he didn't have one, he'd be dead. Like, let's just be honest here. Like, I'm gonna call a spade a spade. But while they're having this conversation here, back inside the void, Toxin, he can hear this whole thing. And like we seen before, Toxin, he has his suspicions of Brent's father being a guardsman, and he also hears Brent telling him, like, man, I wish Toxin was here, because if he was, then Brent can truly tell if his father was lying. Or better yet, that his father was lying, because he was lying. He was definitely lying. But then after this, then jumping over to DC, it's here where we catch up with Flash's buddy Hank, who at this point is giving Flash the update as far as Carnage planning his attack at the President's Monument during the huge For Humanity rally. But even still at this point, he still hasn't figured out what exactly is going on with Crane, which I think is pretty obvious. But even with him reporting to Flash, he has to cut it short because he figures out that he's been made. And when this happens, Hank just tells Flash to meet him at the rally, but then it's also here where we find out that the person who was following Hank is actually Agony, because even with Hank having his suspicions of Crane and possibly aware of Phage, but even still at this point he's unaware of Agony and even Lasher for that matter. But then it's after this when we go back to the void with Toxin, who's pretty much feeling himself right now after beating Carnage, and even to the point where he's calling it his void. But then it's while he's here where he then sees a glimmer of light, to where with doing so he sees it as like a trespasser in his space. And it's pretty much here where we pick up from the cliffhanger where we ended it in part 5, but with the way that it's done, it's not exactly like a one-to-one, but it works. And really, I'm not too hung up about it because this stuff happens, but usually within tie-ins rather than consecutive issues in a series. But either way, it still works because it's here where Toxin makes his way back to Bryn and he catches him up on everything that had happened in the void, telling him Carnage had sent Phage to Alchemax. But then once again, they kind of have that dad moment because Toxin then apologizes for Brent's dad getting caught up in his dad's crossfire, but he then goes on to let Brent know that he believes that he's found some help, and it's here with doing so to where he takes Brent into the void. But when he does this, at this point in time, both Flash and Andy are already there. And in this case, Andy's investigation is shown a bit differently, with her more or less walking Flash through the whole process of her trying to figure out what's going on. And in this case, while they're still in the void, Toxin and Brent then pop up, and it's here where both sides kind of share the intel of their experiences with Toxin just running around telling everybody, like, I whooped Carnage ass. I just wanted you to know how you been. Like, he just couldn't wait to tell him. And like, for me, it really gives off this vibe to where Toxin is just ready to be back. Like, there's a part of him that's just ready to have that power back. But then also you got the case of Toxin just letting them know that he's alive, and him filling them in on that part after he's gotten the important stuff out of the way. Like, imagine this guy just being dead for years, or you thinking he's been dead for years, and then he just comes back greeting you like that. But with them all getting caught up here, like, Flash lets them know, like, beating him in the void, that's one thing, but facing Carnage in DC, like, that's a whole nother story. But then shortly after this, they all exit the void, group up, and they then make their way to DC so they can link up with Hank and meet him at Crane's rally. And of course, at this point, to make their way there, instead of web slinging, they just take to the skies. Which really, since King in Black, I feel like the wings has just been a great addition, because imagine web slinging across country or something like that. Like, just taking flight makes way more sense. Alright, so jumping back in at this point with Andy, Flash, and Toxin making their way over to DC, and with Andy and Flash doing so with just getting the revelation that Toxin is still alive, along with the update of him having a new host. But with them sharing with Toxin the recent details that Flash had got from his buddy Hank, with Hank telling them that the president is likely the next target for Crane's upcoming rally for the Friends of Humanity. And keep in mind, when Hank had initially told this to Flash, he knew that he was made, which is also what put a bit of the urgency on Flash getting down there. But what he didn't know is that he was made by Agony, who at this point is like your unknown player as far as what Flash and the others know in the case of the symbiotes who have already sided with Carnage. And so it's here where we jump in, where we actually go back weeks before the current situation, and even though we're not told how many weeks, we get a pretty good idea really quick. Because initially when we jump in with this young lady named Gemma, who's the deputy communications director for Senator Crane, and right away when we jump in, we catch a gist of the work environment within Senator Crane's office, with a lot of her male colleagues addressing her as an assistant and telling her to fetch coffee, and really just completely disregarding her position as director. And really as quickly with this little flashback where we're showing Gemma, who gets the coffee anyway, and really just doing so to be nice, and perhaps too nice, but with just seeing this glimpse at some weeks back, it gives us a look into some of the things that Gemma would have to endure during her time working for Senator Crane. But then towards the end of this flashback, we follow Gemma making her way back to the office, And it's here where we get a bit of the time frame of when this was as she steps outside and the King in Black symbiote dragons are just everywhere. But as we jump to current date, it's here where we see this flashback was kind of done in a way to where Gemma's mind had wandered off and she had just thought back to this particular day, because then it's here where Arthur Crane, the son of the senator, he more or less snaps Gemma out of this flashback by not only saying her name correctly, but then also bringing her coffee the specific way that she liked it. And really what this shows us early on with introducing us to Gemma and then showing us the dynamic between her and Arthur, who in Arthur's case we kind of knew already that he's not a jerk, but also in this case we're shown more clearly that he's not exactly in line with the way that his father runs things and the majority of the people that his father has working for him. And we'll get more into the specifics of that a little bit later. But with Arthur telling Gemma that she needs to take a break because she's overworked and underappreciated, and he insists that she steps away and does something that she enjoys in hopes of that clearing up her mind and making her feel better. And she takes that advice and she goes for a run with saying that it's something that she hasn't done in a while. But here's where we start to get into a deeper perspective of this, because at this point when we jump over to the National Mall, to at this time it's like the day before the big rally, but then it's here where we run across Flash, Andy, and Bren, who had just made their way to DC before meeting up with Hank. And with Bren being handed one of these flyers for the rally, he then asks Flash like if people really believe this stuff, with all this talk about not just symbiotes but aliens period being a menace. But as Flash breaks it down for Bren and he tells him like how people just believe this stuff, and like as he's answering this question we get a bit of this overlap to where we then follow Gemma, who continues on her run past dark to where she eventually then runs into some muggers. But as we follow her, we also get Flash's answers to Bren, at the same time where we see that Gemma is the new host of the Agony Symbiote. But with the way that Flash breaks this down, he tells Bren that scared, insecure people will believe anything that makes them feel like they have control over their lives. So when the right person comes along and tells them that the future that they were promised was stolen from them, and that creates the situation to where it's easier to blame someone else rather than confront their own monsters. And eventually what this leads to is these same people with these insecurities resorting to hurting people and believing that that makes them powerful. And really it's this belief system that makes these people easy targets for the predators out there who will target these people's insecurities and pander a message to them in order to manipulate these people in a time of weakness. And with Flash breaking down this idea for Bren, he's really talking about Crane supporters in general being manipulated by Crane's campaign, but also at the same time, without Flash knowing, he had also described Gemma's situation with her running into the Agony Symbiote during King in Black, and how that symbiote gave Gemma the idea of taking the power back, but of course doing so in a way that just suited Agony. And this definitely leans into the Carnage portion as well, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But from here we pretty much get this moment where Arthur tells Gemma that he isn't too fond of the way that his father runs his campaign, and even goes as far to tell her that he was considered running for office himself. And with saying this, they kind of play with the idea of Gemma being his director of communications in the event that he would do so. But after this, it's here where we then jump over to Flash and the others, with them meeting up with Hank, who had picked up quite a bit from Senator Crane, with no one thinking that Hank was that important, and because of that they just kind of said whatever even when he was around. But it's here where Hank lets them know that Senator Crane is planning to have his rally this upcoming weekend, so that it'll happen at the same time while the president is dedicating a memorial for all the people who were lost during the symbiote invasion. And with hearing this, both Andy and Flash, they're just like, okay, well we can't let Carnage just assassinate the president in broad daylight, because that alone would just throw the country into chaos. But at this time, with all four of them having this discussion, and with Flash interchanging the name Carnage with Senator Crane, and this was like Hank's confirmation of the two being the same person. And with hearing this, Hank, he flipped out, and for good reason. But Flash lets Hank know that Crane isn't the only one with a symbiote ace up his sleeve. And it's here where Flash gets Andy to try to reach out to Carnage again to see if she can sense him and possibly eavesdrop and get more details about how all this is going down the next day. Because now with them being closer, she has a better chance to listen in with the hopes that she doesn't get caught. But when Andy reaches out, the first thing she picks up is Gemma and Agony. And when we go from here over to Gemma's place, we then come to find out that Gemma has created a shrine out of the different limbs and the skulls. She even got a backbone lamp. But with us seeing the shrine that she's created from her different victims, and like this really just shows us how deep and how twisted things have gotten ever since she's picked up the Agony Symbiote. But then also with seeing this, and I feel kind of messed up for saying it, but I kind of want a spin-off now. Like I want to see where this goes. But with us seeing this, keep in mind that Annie, she is like eavesdropping on this whole thing. But it's then also during this time where Gemma and Agony are met by Carnage, who's pretty much checking in the night before, and with doing so he sets up this whole scene where like the symbiotes, they all go to a bar, which on the surface it sounds like the beginning of a joke. And I'm not gonna front, like the first time that I'd seen it, I thought it was a joke, but then towards the end of the issue, it then made more sense, and we'll revisit that in just a little bit. But with Andy looking in and seeing this whole meeting and this whole setup to where Carnage has sat down the other Life Foundation symbiotes in order for them to talk about their big plans for tomorrow, but then throughout the course of this meeting, Carnage, he then addresses Andy, letting her know directly that he's aware that she's listening, and it's here where Andy tells Flash and the others about all the Life Foundation symbiotes that Carnage has brought together, but also that Carnage knows that they're coming, which at this point takes away from them the element of surprise, and from there Flash tells Hank to keep an eye on the president while him and the others prep to get in position for the rally coming up tomorrow. But also when moving forward, I do want to mention that we kind of get this moment where Carnage asks Gemma if she's having second thoughts, and she responds like no, of course not, as long as Carnage doesn't forget his promise to both Gemma and Agony. And with that, like that's one of those things I want to kind of save my thoughts for for the end. Like we'll definitely revisit that. But then after this, then jumping over to the next day, and it's here where we see Flash and the others watching over the president as he presents the memorial in honor of those who were lost during the recent symbiote invasion. But with them watching this memorial, nothing happens. No Life Foundation symbiotes in sight, no guardsmen, no nothing. But as the president finishes his speech, it's here where they realize like if Carnage wanted to go after the president, this would have been the place and the time. But as the speech comes to a close and they see that nothing has happened, and it's here where they then realize that not only is the president not the target, but then also that Senator Peter Crane is not Carnage's host. But instead it's been Arthur Crane, the goody two-shoes, the son of the senator, the whole time. And he just stabs Hank in the back while telling him attaboy, because Carnage had also been playing Flash and Andy by coordinating Peter Crane's campaign, but also misleading Hank into believing that it was Arthur's father who was up to something this whole time. And it's like, man, like that was a really good misdirect. But then to go back to what I mentioned earlier, like this was the whole point of Carnage setting up the whole bar scene with the meeting with Gemma and the other symbiotes, because as soon as Andy reached out looking for Carnage, he had already planned to set the stage to put on a show, so to speak, in order to play into Andy and Flash's fears and set them up before he revealed that his real target is Senator Peter Crane. But then also in the case of that promise that Gemma had mentioned, as far as Carnage keeping his promise to both Gemma and Agony, it really has me feeling like in that case, it's going back to what Arthur/Carnage had said when he mentioned that he doesn't like the way that his father is running things and he was thinking of running for office himself. During that case, it feels like Carnage was talking about both Eddie and Venom, and that somewhere along the line he had promised Gemma that when all this is said and done, that she'll be number 2 in his new kingdom. Once again, just kind of promising that seat of power to both Gemma and Agony. And man, like Carnage, he played everybody in this issue. Alright, so jumping back in right after Carnage had just impaled Hank and left him for dead. And it's here where we also get this moment to where Riot, he sticks around and he picks up Hank's phone and he just gets to bragging about how well Carnage played everybody, which is one of those things that's always strange when people brag on other people's achievements. But in the middle of him talking smack to Flash, Hank then just gets back up, and the next thing you know, Riot is decapitated, and a very familiar hand then picks up the phone, and it's right here where we see that Sleeper is back. And I know a ton of you guys, like myself, have just been like, where's Sleeper? Because he's pretty much just been MIA since Venom Island. But also with seeing him here, it also answers that lingering question, to where it was like, why would Flash send Hank in so close to investigate and to look for Carnage, with Hank not having a symbiote or really having any kind of tactical advantage for that matter? And what we come to find out pretty quickly is that unbeknownst to Hank, Flash has had Sleeper with him this whole time. And even at this point, with Sleeper taking control and placing Hank in a state of recovery, Hank is none the wiser to what's going on now. And when Flash asks Sleeper just to make sure, Flash then tells him to keep it that way, because even up till now Hank has been a bit weirded out by the whole symbiote thing, and Flash really isn't sure how Hank would respond to it. But even still, Flash wanted to place in a contingency to protect Hank for the possibility of a worst case scenario, which still kind of feels like a violation, but hey, at least Hank's not dead. But then after this, when Flash and the others leave from the president's memorial service and make their way to Senator Crane's rally, and it's here where we see Senator Crane giving his speech, and it comes to the part where he introduces his son to come out as an example of what a real hero looks like, but through the middle of the speech, he's then impaled by Carnage, who admits that as much as he likes Senator Crane, he also believes that the senator lacks the imagination to even imagine that there's a bigger predator than him out there. And with saying this, he then just tears Senator Crane to pieces on stage, live in living color, in front of everyone at this rally and everyone who's watching at home on television. And for Carnage, this was the goal. Like, he even looks in the camera as the other Life Foundation symbiotes come out, and he looks in the camera and just tells everybody at home, like, you're next. But effectively at this point, like, this is what Carnage was aiming to do, because now with people seeing these symbiotes tear people apart left and right, either on live television before they cut to commercial, which I'm sure they did by now, but whether it be live at home or some of the people who witnessed this firsthand, this is going to do nothing but boost up the support for the Friends of Humanity. And for whoever steps up to the plate after Senator Crane, they're going to have a lot of power and a lot more support after a display like this, because it's pure horror. And even if somebody watching this was just on the fence as far as whether they supported symbiotes or not, or even the cause that was just against aliens altogether, like, I'd imagine a bunch of those guys are now going to side with the Friends of Humanity after seeing this display, even after King in Black. But then it's here where Sleeper arrives, and with doing so, he cuts open the fence so that the people here on the field, they got a better chance of just running and getting out of there. And with Sleeper arriving, he initially goes for Phage, and when Lasher sees this, he then tells Agony, because with seeing this, Lasher, he's a bit in panic mode, because regardless of them effectively doing what they needed to do, they still gotta make an exit. But Agony then tells Lasher that they don't have to worry about that, because they run the Friends of Humanity, and really if they wanted to, they can just switch back into their cover identities and just tell the Friends of Humanity to aim for whoever they said was the threat. But at this point, with Flash, Toxin, and Andy making their way there, right away they let Agony and Lasher know that they gotta make it out of this mess before they even think of getting to the next step. But then it's here where we get a bit of our different matchups, to where on one hand you have Silence versus Agony, and then you have Toxin, who then moves from Phage and makes his way to Lasher, which, to be honest, in my opinion, like, Toxin should be able to wash this guy. But I know Toxin, he isn't up to full power just yet, so for the time being they do go back and forth for a while. But then it's here where we see Flash go up against Carnage. And when this happens, we get a bit more of the details about the planning of Carnage up to this point, because initially Carnage was aiming to make his way to Senator Crane, like he was the next stop after Arthur Crane. But after Carnage had bonded with Arthur Crane, it had then realized that this guy who had seemed to be like the goody two-shoes, that he was actually a lot like Cletus Cassidy. And it's here where we get a glimpse of Arthur Crane's childhood, which on one hand reminds me a lot of James Gordon Jr., with Arthur Crane starting off with killing animals, and then later homeless people, then after that, classmates. And when Carnage saw all this after bonding with Arthur, he was like, oh no, this dude is perfect. Like, we're gonna stop this right here. Because for years, for Arthur Crane, he's hidden this dark side to himself. And for the longest time, he's kept up this identity of him being the super nice, super kind, wouldn't hurt a fly type of guy, which for him couldn't be any further than the truth. So for Carnage, with him bonding with Arthur, he just took this whole act to the next level. But then it's here in the middle of Flash and Carnage going back and forth with one another, to where Tony Stark then shows up with his Extrembio armor from King in Black. And as soon as I seen this, the first thing I thought was like, man, Tony Stark just wanted to show up and show out. But with him coming here, he does effectively separate the Carnage symbiote from Arthur Crane. But then as soon as he does, Carnage then goes for the Grendel within the Extrembiote suit, and he just stops Tony in his tracks. And really this whole time, that's been one of the biggest drawbacks of this suit for Tony, because even though he had infused Extremis with one of the Grendels from King in Black, he had never taken full control, or as Flash would say, he never got the full cooperation of this Grendel the entire time, with Tony only trying to control it. And Carnage makes him pay for that by first breaking his arm, and immediately after, Carnage lets Tony know who really controls the symbiotes around here. But another thing I want you guys to keep in mind here is, like, with Carnage separated from Arthur Crane, he wants Carnage back, bad. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for now. But in this moment here where Carnage goes for the kill on Tony, he's immediately then stopped by Flash, who right away just unleashes everything on Carnage. And with doing so, effectively saving Tony, who Marvel's just been killing left and right like it's whatever. Like, him and Doctor Strange been getting the business lately. But here it's not the case, because Tony's saved by Flash and he's okay. And I mean, he's not okay, but he's alive. But then also it's here where Carnage, he then takes the Extrembiote suit, he grabs Agony, and he just takes off. And with doing so, kind of bragging to Flash and letting him know that he accomplished what he meant to do here. But then as Carnage and Agony leave, you then kind of have Lasher and Phage, who are then just watching them fly off, and they're just kind of like, man, that's messed up, just gonna leave us out here. because apparently these two, they didn't get the memo on how to make wings, like they missed that day. And I mean, at this point, it's not even a thing anymore to where you have to have had a Grendel to be able to do it. But in any case, since Lasher and Phage couldn't make their way out, this then gets them apprehended and sent on their way to Alchemax. And when this happens, like, you kind of get a bit of this thing to where Alchemax, they're kind of on the side of Flash and the others for stopping this, but I don't expect that to go any much further outside of this issue or this event, with the exception of Dr. Steven. But then also, after things have calmed down, we then get this moment to where the guardsmen, they're questioning Arthur Crane, and when they do, he starts capping big time, and he tells the guardsmen that he had nothing to do with what Carnage had planned, which we know couldn't be any further from the truth with the way that he was begging Carnage to come back after the confrontation with Tony. But then it's after this when we see Flash catch up with Hank, and at this point, because Hank doesn't really know what had happened after he died, I don't know how else to put it, but because he just remembers blacking out as if he had only been knocked out, he thinks that he had just dropped the ball in this whole situation. But in response, Flash assures him that Hank did a lot more than he gives himself credit, and had Hank not been involved, a lot more people would have died. But even in this moment with Flash catching up with Hank, he still doesn't tell him about Sleeper, but instead he just tells Hank that he'll be in touch, and he just kind of leaves it there. But then after this, when Flash then goes to meet back up with Andy and Bren, and it's here where Bren kind of lets him have it for secretly sending Sleeper to bond with Hank without him knowing about it. And initially Flash goes on the defensive side about it, because if he didn't send Sleeper, then Hank, he definitely would have been dead. But nonetheless, Flash knows that he needs to tell Hank about it eventually, and it's here where he tells Bren that when he figures out how to tell Hank, he will. But then also in this conversation, we get this moment to where Andy, she tells Bren that what they're doing is too dangerous and that it would be safer if Bren would go home. But Bren's not trying to hear that, because he knows that him and Toxin made a difference out there, and he wants to stay with Flash and Andy in case any of these guys come back. And it's also here at this point where we then go over to Alchemax, and it's here that we see with Dr. Steven that Lasher, Phage, and Riot, that they all been taken in. But with seeing this at the same time, like, you know, like it ain't but a matter of time before these guys get back out. And I say that even with Dr. Steven upgrading the symbiote security protocols. But then also what ends up happening is like Andy and Flash, they both agree to let Bren tag along, because for one, he is the host that Toxin had chose, but then also if something were to happen again, Bren would be safer with them, rather than having to deal with a full-on attack all by himself. But then when Bren gets a bit ahead of himself and he tells Flash how they need him and how they couldn't have won this today without him, and it's here where Flash lets him know like we didn't win anything, because a lot of people still died. Iron Man got put in the hospital, and Carnage got away with his Symbiote tech. Not to mention, a lot of this got caught and put on the news. Like, kid, we were caught in 4K. And because of that, now the friends of humanity are just looking like humanity's best friend. But also with Carnage killing Senator Peter Crane practically in front of the whole world, this had then made Peter Crane a martyr. And with the governor now appointing Arthur Crane in his father's seat in the Senate, this only spells out wins for Carnage. But then it's after this where we then catch up with both Arthur and Gemma, who in her case, she's still bonded to Agni at this point. But it's here where Arthur, he's practically begging her to bring back Carnage, or at least tell her if Carnage is coming back. But at this point, she really doesn't know what Carnage has planned for his next move. But she does tell Arthur that Carnage still sees him as useful. And really at this point, we just get Arthur who lets her know like he'll do anything that Carnage wants, because he's still in hopes that they'll be reunited someday. But that's pretty much where it ends here. But so now these events are supposed to continue in some capacity within the new Venom series starting in October, which is written by Al Ewing with illustrations from Brian Hitch. So you already know that series is gonna be nuts. And really, hopefully, I'm hoping that we get an explanation to why Dylan and Eddie weren't shown to have like the slightest inkling of any of this happening throughout Extreme Carnage. But I'm sure we'll get all those answers and more within a few weeks. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. All right, later.